And he says, "Shut up and take my money." My two favorites from LawTube, whatever that is, Branka, you need to do a more non-teaching streams. You need to do more non-teaching streams.
I do that when I'm a guest on other people's channels, folks. All these law tubers, they're all on at like 10 o'clock at night and midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm old. I need to be in bed by then.
Exactly.
So I do my own stuff when, during the day, and occasionally I'll be a guest on someone else's show and I won't wear a tie and we'll tell jokes and have a couple drinks and have fun. But like I'm not setting up a second Branka stream for 2 o'clock in the morning. That's not happening.
Angel of Sin says Branka put on his tie this morning, but left off the tie in his heart.
Because I just heard the news. I was away all weekend. Good news. That prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore City's state's attorney, had lost her bid for re-election, and that's wonderful news for reasons I will share with you today. But in short, because she is a shitbag of a human being and a prosecutor, and nothing can make me happier than to see her removed from power. So Marilyn Mosby, good old Marilyn Mosby, this hot, steaming pile of garbage of a human being. She is a classic Soros-type, critical race theory type prosecutor who runs for and takes that job with unbelievable amounts of financing behind her, basically buys the seat, and she's buying it for a political agenda. All right, so this is how the media operates, right? They don't have facts or evidence to indicate these officers did anything wrong, so they use innuendo like this, that Freddie Gray was placed headfirst into a van, thus the spinal injury. Just completely contemptible. So when all this was unrolling, of course, Freddie Gray had his spinal injury. 7 or 10 days afterwards, after this event, he would end up dying as a result of those injuries. And the Baltimore Police Department, of course, we have an in-custody death, so they're investigating. They've assigned an investigator to this case, a black woman, by the way. And she's investigating, and she's looking at all the evidence, and she's not seeing anything that would indicate that any of these officers had done anything wrong. And she was preparing to deliver her report to her superiors, indicating as much. There's no evidence that any officer did anything wrong to result in Freddie Gray's death. The medical examiner calls it a shallow diving type of neck injury that could easily have happened just because Freddie Gray stood up in the van. There's an alternative explanation consistent with the outcome and consistent with innocence of all these officers. And hours before she delivered that report to her superiors, Marilyn Mosby takes the podium outside City Hall or some other government building. That's the image that you can see here. Let me pull it up real quickly, even though it's going to block me out. This is the image you can see here. She takes that podium and she announces, without alerting anybody, that she's bringing these charges as serious as murder against those 6 officers. Shocking the Baltimore Police Department. They had no notification that Marilyn Mosby was going to make that announcement to the media. And what she says is, well, I have my own investigators in the prosecutor's office, which is true, and they conducted their own investigation, and they've concluded that we have probable cause to bring charges of serious murder against these 6 police officers. Did she release that evidence? The results of that investigation? Nope. She didn't. We're just going right to trial. You'll see the evidence at trial. Well, a couple problems with this. One is, at trial, we didn't see any such evidence. It never appeared. Second, after this whole house of cards prosecution of these 6 officers began to collapse, guess who came forward? The chief investigator in Marilyn Mosby's office. Because now lawsuits were flying around. After these officers have been cleared and it was clear there was no real evidence against them, they started bringing lawsuits against Marilyn Mosby and anybody else involved. And it was clear to the chief investigator that he was going to be in the hot seat. And he came out and made a press statement saying, hey, I don't know what Mosby's talking about. I never conducted any investigation. I never had any evidence. So this whole claim by Mosby that she had some parallel secret investigation being run out of her office that had evidence of guilt of these police officers was nonsense. It was a complete effing fabrication. It gets even worse. I mentioned that the reason the open air raid on that block had happened in the first place was because a local politician for that community had called Mosby's office. And it was she who asked the Baltimore Police Department to make that raid. So the only reason the raid happened at all was because it was at Marilyn Mosby's request. You think the media reported that? Nope. By the way, that politician who asked Mosby to ask the Baltimore PD to launch that raid, guess who that guy was? That was Marilyn Mosby's husband. You think the media reported that? Nope. So that's what really happened, folks, was Marilyn Mosby's local politician husband asked her, as the recently elected Baltimore City State's attorney, to ask the Baltimore PD to launch a raid on that open air drug market because his constituents in that community were complaining about it. The police launched the raid. Freddie Gray ended up dying as a result. And was that the motivation for Marilyn Mosby to bring those charges? So that no one would look too closely at her and her husband and their role in that happening? Basically, a cover-up to protect herself. She was willing to send 6 police officers to prison on charges as serious as murder to cover up her oops, to protect her political ass. Could anybody be that contemptible? And keep in mind, even if the officers are acquitted, which was not her intent, of course, her intent was they be convicted, this is certainly a life-destroying event for them. How could they ever go back to being in their careers now that they're racist murderers of Freddie Gray? By the way, folks, not only were all these cops either acquitted or ultimately the charges dropped because it was clear they would be acquitted, they were, of course, as you might imagine, also subject to departmental review to see if they had violated any regulations of their department, not even criminal conduct, but had knowingly violated mere regulations of their department and ought to be fired or otherwise sanctioned for those missteps. Guess what, folks? They were not found to have done anything wrong, even on a regulation level. And they were all eligible to return to their jobs, and most of them did. So they literally had done nothing wrong. This is the person who Marilyn Mosby is, folks. By the way, typically with these Soros-elected prosecutors, as soon as she got into office, she either fired or drove out all the really capable prosecutors in the office, stopped prosecuting crimes, stopped prosecuting drug crimes, property crimes, all the usual stuff. So, of course, guess what happened to crime in Baltimore, which was not, by the way, the most peaceable of cities before Marilyn Mosby arrived on the scene? Crime skyrocketed in Baltimore. And we're really talking about largely the black areas of Baltimore, the poor areas of Baltimore. They suffered horribly under the prosecutorial regime of Marilyn Mosby. You think she gave a damn about that? No. So there are, of course, one of the reasons Marilyn Mosby lost this bid for re-election. It has little to do with Freddie Gray because she won re-election after the Freddie Gray debacle. She got elected a second time, believe it or not. Also, all the lawsuits against her by the officers were dismissed by the courts because prosecutors have generally qualified immunity for anything they do in office. Frankly, I think that the lying about this parallel investigation, that alone should have been enough to squash immunity in this case. She was not acting in good faith in bringing these prosecutions. She was acting maliciously for political purposes. She ought to have been subject to suit for damages by these officers, but the court said no. She's a prosecutor. She has generalized immunity for all this. So all those suits were dismissed, despite the havoc she created.
Who was wreaking a lot of havoc on the community.
He had to do that on purpose.
Who had that bingo card?
I know
who
he
had
did
that
it.
card.
He had to have listened to everybody loving him saying havoc, and he had to throw that. And he was wreaking.
You
havoc.
prompted that, Nick. You bastard. You texted him.
I can't believe it. Oh my gosh.
The lies she told, the deceptions,